Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Pan Macmillan India, I take great pleasure in welcoming all of you to the launch of the third edition of Ramachandra Guha's definitive history of the nation, India After Gandhi. We first published India After Gandhi in 2007, 10 years after Peter Strauss, who once ran Picador, asked an unsuspecting Ram Guha to write a history of independent India. To quote Ram, he then considered himself principally an academic historian who wrote for his peers and for university students. But the idea's appeal soon took hold, and after years of primary research, filled up notebooks and eventually a whole study, the first draft of what would eventually become India After Gandhi was born. The chapters were first collected in a folder titled Mythical History Book, as Ram tells us in his preface to the second edition, and finally submitted as History Book Revised. Since the days of its research, to soon being hailed as a modern classic, to its third and latest edition, both the book and its protagonist have experienced an eventful journey. In the decade after the book's first publication, India witnessed two general elections, the fall of the Congress and the rise of Narendra Modi, a major anti-corruption movement among other transformative events. Its 10th anniversary edition, published in 2017, took stock of all this and more. The edition we are launching today comes only 5 years after the last one. For reasons Ram has explained in a new preface, it has partly to do with dramatic events and transformations India has seen in a short span of time, from demonetization to a devastating pandemic, Narendra Modi's re-election as Prime Minister, the abrogation of Kashmir's autonomous status, to large-scale citizens' protests and unprecedented state crackdown on dissent. Events so radical that they have prompted noteworthy updates to the book's closing, as captured in its new epilogue, and as some among you might have already noticed, on the cover itself. With the addition of this new material, namely a long chapter and a fresh epilogue, India After Gandhi becomes more complete, urgent, and essential than ever, as India slides from a 50-50 to a 30-70 democracy. As Ram's publishers, we are proud to be associated with this tremendous book that has made and continues to make unparalleled contributions to the historiography of India. On that note, we would like to thank Ramachandra Guha once again for giving us this outstanding classic of history writing. A scholar of great stature and a generous human being, his entire career, he says, seems in retrospect to have been an extended and painful preparation for the writing of this book. We would also like to express our heartfelt thanks to Naresh Fernandes, journalist, author, and editor of Scroll.in, for joining us today to be in conversation with Ram. I now welcome Ramachandra Guha and Naresh Fernandes to come to the stage and unveil the third edition of India After Gandhi. Congratulations, Ram. Can I request you to say a few words before we begin the conversation?
So thank you, Tista. I would just like to remember one person today and single him out because he is Bengali but notoriously shy. And also ferociously competent. Now, I don't know whether that goes with being extremely shy. His name is Rajdeep Mukherjee, somewhere at the back there. He is now managing director of Pan Macmillan. But it was he who called me in Bangalore, which was not yet then Bengaluru, 25 years ago, and said someone called Peter Strauss has to meet you. And Rajdeep has been with this book and its journey all through these 2 decades and a half, the 3 editions. So he's the other constant, India After Gandhi and Rajdeep Mukherjee. So thank you, Rajdeep.
I just wanted to ask Naresh if you would now begin the conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the launch of this new edition of Ramachandra Guha's India After Gandhi, a history. In the prologue to his magisterial work, Ram describes a period in the 1990s when his daily stroll to the National Archives took him past a village of colorful tents on Rajpath, each occupied by an ever-changing kaleidoscope of groups wearing placards highlighting their specific cause. There would be farmers demanding higher prices for their crops, who would be replaced the next day by residents of a section of the Himalayas demanding their own state. And then their place would be taken by people from southern Karnataka, urging that their language be accorded official recognition. As it had been in Ghalib's day, Ram writes, Indian was fighting Indian. There were signs of discord everywhere. And this sparked the idea for a book that sadly never got written. I wish I had the time to walk on Rajpath every day from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, chronicling the appearance and disappearance of the tents and their residents, Ram writes. That would be the story of India as told from a single street and in a single year. Over the past few years, Indians attempting to conduct debates with the state have not been afforded the courtesy of being allowed to make their claims with such equanimity. In many cases, lathis and bulldozers have persuaded them into silence. Those who do make it to the national capital are tucked away in a back lane, out of sight of regular folk. Despite this, one of the most heated debates in contemporary India is actually playing out in full public view. To get a sense of it, all you have to do is glance at the shelves of the bookshops in an Indian airport, or even easier, open the RWA group chat on your WhatsApp. Even as the debates about fundamental issues like citizenship and free expression are beaten down, the ruling party and its adherents, as we know, have launched a war on history. To advance their majoritarian project, the past is being reimagined, rewritten, and weaponized. As Pranay Kotastani writes in his essay, The Closing of the Indian Mind, these revised versions of history not only counter our view of the past, they aim to delegitimize the founding principles on which the modern Indian state is built. All of this makes the new edition of India After Gandhi even more essential, and an exercise even more fraught with peril. Ram, when you wrote the first edition of this book in 2007, did you ever imagine that history would become such an intensely contested ground? And what has transpired in India over the last 15 years to make history writing such a battlefield?
So, I think history writing has always been a battlefield. The question is, with what tools the historian fighting his or her battles enters into warfare, with what kind of skills, agenda or no agenda. But most of these battles are fought over a relatively distant past. And India After Gandhi was kind of venturing into a terrain over which was terra nulla. There were no battles, there was no kind of serious reckoning with what had happened over the 6 decades of Indian history. When this book was commissioned in 1997-98, 5 decades. And I remember Peter Strauss, who commissioned the book, telling me, he said, 50 years is long enough to look back, you know. So that's I wish I didn't have to prepare a third edition. I wish there were battles about the last 30 or 40 years. And I say, you know, I say in the preface to the first edition, just give me a minute, I quote the great French historian Marc Bloch, where I say that, you know, if you just, this is from someone I regard as probably the greatest historian of the modern period, Marc Bloch, one of the founders of the Annales School, author of such great works as French Rural History, Feudal Society, The Royal Touch, also a resistance fighter who was shot by the Gestapo. And he says in his book, French Rural History, he says, I liken myself to an explorer making a rapid survey of the horizon before plunging into thickets from which the wider view is no longer possible. The gaps in my account are naturally enormous. I have done my best not to conceal any deficiencies, whether in the state of our knowledge or in my own documentation. When the time comes for my own work to be superseded by studies of deeper penetration, I shall feel well rewarded if confrontation with my false conjectures, I shall feel well rewarded if confrontation with my false conjectures has made history learn the truth about itself. Now, when I wrote this book 15 years ago, I saw it, as I say, every work of history is interim. It's there to be superseded. No, I didn't want to be adding 50 pages, 100 pages. And I wish some of these revisionist historians, instead of talking about the Mughals and their alleged perfidies or the greatness of our ancient civilization such as it was, would turn their critical gaze to this unfolding political experiment, which I also call in the book the most reckless political experiment in human history, and provide an account different from mine, superior to mine, or at least in argument with mine. So I think it's, in that sense, well, of course there's been a lot of high quality work on different aspects of our contemporary history since this book came out. And there are lots of fine younger scholars, some of which I'm proud to say were discovered by the New India Foundation. But it's interesting that there have been some debates about Nehru and Patel, for example. Now, in the epilogue to this book, I tackle that. Were Nehru and Patel really rivals, as has been made out? But, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, I think that's where I think it's very fruitful terrain. This is by no means false modesty. I quote Mark Bloch to talk about deficiencies in his account. Now, there are clear deficiencies in my account. And one deficiency in this book was pointed out by a very wise Indian who often used, probably still is at the IIC sometimes, Ashok Desai, the economist and columnist, who reviewed this book. And he said, this book has hardly any tables, which means it does not pay enough attention to economics. And he was absolutely right. Now, again, if you look at debates about economics, it's all about, was colonialism exploitative, or did the British actually give us modern technical infrastructure like the railways and a market which enabled us to grow? Now, where are the histories of post-independence our economic life and our economic thought? So I think somehow it's easy for ideologues particularly to engage in debates about the distant past. But while writing this book, one lesson I learned was you need a generation's distance to write history. Now, we can't really understand the significance of Narendra Modi or what impact demonetization will have on our economic life in the long term. But we can certainly historically assess what the emergency was all about. So it's a very long answer to your question, but these revisionist interpretations are located too far back in the past. I wish they would engage with post-independence history too.
Sometime not so long ago, you gave a lecture titled History Beyond Chauvinism. How do you think history can be written beyond the chauvinisms of ideology and national identity? So,
at least one must try. One must be conscious of it. Even political writing, I also write a column. And I believe that no writer should identify with a political party or with a politician. Now, it helps that I'm in Bangalore, which is a long way away. But for a historian too, I think it's the archives that throw up surprises that confound any ideology you may come with. Likewise, nationalism. Now, this book, as I said, it has many deficiencies, but I hope it has some merits too. And I personally am proudest of the one aspect of this book, and that is when I wrote about our conflicts with China and with Pakistan, I wrote as a historian, not as an Indian. When the first edition came out, there was an interview by Shankarshan Thakur, very wide-ranging interview, but the magazine he then worked with had to have a sensationalist headline, which is always the case. Scroll is an honorable exception to that. Thank you for lowering the temperature of discourse. But the magazine gave the headline, Guha says India's case on Kashmir is not constitutionally foolproof. I did say that, but I said many other things too. Now that was picked up by a Pakistani newspaper, which then represented the headline to a long and rich and diverse interview, and said, Indian historian says India has no case on Kashmir. Now, actually what I said was, Pakistan's case on Kashmir is also not constitutionally foolproof, and nor is India's. So I think, likewise with our China dispute, if you look at the whole history of the border conflict, China has a strong case when it comes to the eastern border. We have a stronger case when it comes to our western border, but that's part of the complication. So I think that is something which historians, the chauvinism of nation, of ideology, of caste, of gender, of religion, of identity, they're always hard for you to overcome. But at least you must be aware of them, and I think that's something I would always try to do. I think at least in a work of this kind, maybe in newspaper columns or in tweets, you're wearing your beliefs on your sleeve. But when you're studying the past, you have to give this past the respect it deserves.
What are the challenges of writing history as you're doing in real time, almost? Your book goes up to Narendra Modi praying at the Kashi Vishwanath temple in 2021.
So again, as I said, obviously, here it's historically informed journalism. The closer one comes to the present. So the last 10 or 15 years, perhaps that's what it is. So in that sense, it's slightly more tentative. You don't have the kind of depth of first-hand primary research you would have. The archives don't exist, and so on. But yet, the changes in the last 5 or 6 years have been so profound and transformative, as I argue in my book. The last 5 years have been as transformative, for good and for bad, as the first 5 years of independence. Between 47, when India was freed and partitioned, till the first election of 52, and of course, shall we say, from demonetization, which is where I start the new chapter in this book, till today. And I have, obviously, this is the part of the book where I'm not completely sure of my ground, but I still try and look at the different aspects of what's going on and try and, not be too, shall we say, judgmental and somewhat cautious or restrained in my judgments. But it's the case that probably, and I think for most readers, it's the 50s and the 60s and the 70s that will be more interesting than the more recent past.
But even as you sort of make the distinction between being a historian and being a citizen, you do participate actively in national life. Those images of you being detained during protests for the Citizenship Amendment Act in Bangalore in 2017 are pretty dramatic. And then in 2017, you joined a group of concerned citizens, including Nandini Sundar, to file a PIL against Salva Judum. How do you compartmentalize your roles as an engaged citizen, as a historian, and how do they feed into each other?
By the way, I mean, it's difficult. But as important are the causes I do not join. For example, in 2019, when I was when I went for that protest, the reason I went is that I'm a biographer of Gandhi. And what did Gandhi stand for? Hindu-Muslim harmony, and a law that is discriminating against. And Gandhi presciently warned us, and we are speaking a day after the 75th anniversary of his martyrdom, and the prescience of his warning is unfolding before our eyes every day. But shortly afterwards, there was the farmer protest, and I got calls from friends saying, come to Vidhan Sauda, and I said, sorry, but you were there at that. So I said, I understand nothing about, agriculture, farm laws, sorry, I can't come. Now, so there's some things I understand. One is the importance of interfaith harmony. The other is, since Nandini is here, is I began my life as an environmental historian writing about Adivasi. So I think it's important again to not just to pick your public battles wisely, but to go where you have at least some understanding. It's like there's a tendency, perhaps for some people, to be always engaged in all kinds of battles. And for me, I mean, it's Adivasis, Hindu-Muslim harmony, and Uttarakhand, because that's my home state where I did my first work, and of course, freedom of intellectual life, but nothing else.
Moving away from the craft of being a historian to your very engaging book, you describe India as an unnatural nation. How did you reach that conclusion?
Yeah, so that, well, actually, the original title of this book was Unnatural Nation. And I'm glad I chose something more bland and more descriptive eventually, because that title comes from, or that phrase, unnatural nation, comes from reflecting on the history of European nationalism. So nationalism is a modern phenomenon, It's not ancient. The Greeks were not nationalists, and the Mauryan Empire was not nationalist. Nationalism is a modern phenomenon dealing with a modern nation state which constructs boundaries, territorial boundaries that are rigorously policed, and in that territory which is now circumscribed and defined and claimed by a particular nation, there are certain markers of national identity. And in 19th century Europe, these markers were a common religion, a common language, and a common enemy. And there's some magnificent works on European nationalism. I'd recommend two. Linda Colley's Britain's Forging a Nation and Eugene Weber's Peasants into Frenchmen, which show how nations were constructed around in the 19th century, around the idea of citizens speaking a common language, broadly having a common faith. So in England, Catholics were second class. In France, Protestants were second class. You know, there's a kind of a national faith, so to say, and of course a common enemy. And India that way was very different in its constitutional conception. Now we may be, I say in the new edition, that the object of the current regime is to make us more of a natural nation. One religion, one language, one enemy, and I don't need to spell it out for you. But the greatness of Indian nationalism, and I think quite a lot of this has to do with two remarkable figures. One, of course, is Gandhi. And the accident of Gandhi spending 2.5 decades in the diaspora, which is where he discovered the diversity of India. He discovered India is not just Gujaratis, it's not just upper caste, it's not just male, and it's not just Hindus. And of course, Tagore, who I think was, as Ravi Shankar famously said, complained that the Bengalis have parochialized Tagore too much. They've kept him too close to their chest. So they haven't allowed the rest of us to appreciate his greatness. And if you read Tagore's writings on nationalism, you get a sense of, what his very different understanding of nationalism was. So that's why, and I think someone like Nehru is actually borrowing from Gandhi and from Tagore. And his debt to Gandhi is well known, but his debt to Tagore is perhaps less visible. So I think that idea of a kind of constitutional patriotism, which is based on values, not identities, is what defined us. And which is unnatural because it was going against the grain. Pakistan was a natural nation. Everyone must speak Urdu. It is a Muslim country, and India is your enemy. Right? It was a perfect European nation in South Asia. And we are becoming that. We are now, or at least the attempt is to make us that. May it not succeed. So I think the word unnatural kind of was coined in that context, against the backdrop of how European nationalism evolved.
As you chronicle India's triumphs and tumults over the past 75 years, you note 4 main axes of conflict. What are they, and what is preeminent at this point?
So, there are probably more than 4, but there's religion, language, caste, class, gender, 5 at least. And now there's a 6th, maybe region, north and south. I'd say today, I think religion is the one that is emerging as the pivotal point of conflict and discrimination, not just conflict, but discrimination, because there's a systematic attempt to make Muslims second-class citizens in this country, right? Now, and it's an attempt that is political, ideological, legislative, social, economic, and so on and so forth, right? So, but the others are also there. I mean, gender is not, is very much an axis of discrimination. Caste maybe also in some areas is played out. Language off and on. But, I think that's again the part of, this is why I describe India as a reckless political experiment. So large, so diverse, so divided, and yet trying to hang together by a thread and also trying to run its politics democratically. Eric Hobsbawm, who was a notorious skeptic about the Indian democratic experiment, but as a Stalinist you would expect him to be that, said only in multinational, multilinguistic states don't work, except in the Soviet Union and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Now, India was trying to defy that, So I think that was the greatness of our national experiment, and I hope we don't lose it. And so, to answer your question, I'd say today religion is the is kind of the more visible fault line, particularly because it is a tacit aspect of the ideology of the ruling party, not an obvious explicit aspect. And it's extraordinary. If you look at Hindutva, I don't want to make this most about Hindutva, but it's kind of a peculiar mixture of paranoia and triumphalism. We will certainly win. We will rule the world, but everyone is against us. We are besieged in our own country. It's kind of a paranoid triumphalism. That's what it is. When Mohan Bhagwat says Muslims should stop feeling superior, when did he talk to an ordinary Indian Muslim last? One wonders. So I think this is something which is obviously the one that is uppermost in one's mind, but the other conflicts also simmer. I mean, the end of my book, I talk about the North-South conflict and what that might mean, particularly in 2026, if we lift the freeze on delimitation of seats and the more backward, reactionary, patriarchal parts of India have an even greater role in our national politics, what will happen. So these different fault lines, at different points of time, one or the other is more dominant.
So even as you note the axes of conflict, you say that there are forces that bind us together. What are these forces that have kept India together?
So historically, obviously there's the constitution, there's the federal system. Historically there was the Congress party, which is not really a pan-Indian party, so it doesn't play that role. The market, freedom of movement. So they are, and again, it's a battle between, forces that unite and forces that divide. It's an open question where this will go.
So stepping away from these sort of larger forces and towering personalities who shaped India, some of the most engaging bits of the book about the lesser-known individuals who have played a part in the national project. Could you please tell us about some of them? Sukumar Sen, there was V.P. Menon, and also some of the women who
So
particularly
early years. So Sukumar Sen was the first election commissioner. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who was of course, was an extraordinary person who had multiple roles and multiple careers: refugee rehabilitation, the revival of crafts. V.P. Menon, who worked in the integration of states. Later on, Sardar Tarlok Singh, who settled the partition refugees in Punjab and Haryana. And of course, some of the activists. Potti Sriramulu, who was fast unto death, led to the creation of linguistic states. Fizo, and had his role in the Naga rebellion, which is, one of the joys of researching this book was that I was discovering things all the time. Obviously, growing up in North India, I knew about the Kashmir conflict, but the depth and intensity of the Naga issue only came to me by researching this book. Obviously, I had Naga friends in college, but that is not. It was only through researching this book that I realized that the Naga National Council actually precedes independence. So, and there were many others one could write about. But it was nice writing about these sort of intermediate figures.
I think one of the slightly depressing things about reading the book is you realize that some conflicts have never gone away. Kashmir being the prime among them. And you've thought a lot about Kashmir, you've visited. How do you see a just resolution in Kashmir?
So, it's of course now it is so difficult, but I think let me put it this way, in the very recent past, we could have got somewhere near a just resolution of the Kashmir conflict. Both in Atal Bihari Vajpayee's term as Prime Minister and Manmohan Singh's term as Prime Minister. And there were many reasons why we didn't, but I'll just focus on one. That is the mala fide and malicious role of the opposition. In a mature democracy, when it comes to important foreign policy questions, one should hope for some bipartisan support. And I'll mention these two. Since you mentioned Kashmir, talk of missed opportunities. When Vajpayee, went by bus to Lahore, and there were conversations going on about, a resolution of the Kashmir dispute, Vajpayee spoke in Srinagar. And he made that famous speech where he said, "Insaniyat ki darye mein," that a solution in the realm of humanity, not just a constitution. At the time, the state government was a coalition of the PDP and the Congress. The Congress boycotted that speech, and I would hold Sonia Gandhi as Congress president responsible. Here is the first Indian Prime Minister to go to Srinagar in almost 2 decades and make a speech of peace and reconciliation, and the Congress, whose it is in power, Vajpayee went to Srinagar in 2003, not as a Swayam Sevak, as the constitutionally elected Prime Minister of India. That's fast forward to 2007, when Manmohan Singh is Prime Minister, and he's in conversations with the Pakistanis, and there's a lot of able diplomats on both sides trying to work out converting the line of control into an official border. And, and what happens? The BJP starts an agitation, blocking the road to the valley from Jammu, so that even medical supplies can't go. Right. Now, what kind of opposition is this? So here are two, relatively recent. I mean, 2007 is 15 years ago, 2003 is 20 years ago. So I don't know, it's like bleak, particularly because of the awful abrogation of 370 and what it means. I mean, it's been 3.5 years. There's still a union territory. There's no sign of elections. God knows what kind of redistricting is going on. But if you look at those two extraordinary missed opportunities, and you would have to blame first the Congress and then the BJP for putting their petty party interest over not just national interest, over the possibility of peace in South Asia.
Staying with the bleak, and I suspect that's going to be much of the rest of the conversation. Just past the halfway mark of the book, we sort of get to the emergency, that sort of period of darkness that's frequently invoked by the BJP and the RSS as a time in which their ideological predecessors led a glorious resistance to Indira Gandhi's dictatorship. What role did the RSS and the Disjuncts really play during that period?
Well, they played some role. So the major Disjuncts leaders were in jail, along with the major socialists and the old Congress and the Swatantara Party leaders. I think some of the student leaders of the RSS were in jail. Others played a less glorious role. I mean, the Satsang Chala, Balasaheb Deoras was in correspondence with Indira Gandhi. But they were part of the, the democratic opposition. I think that cannot be denied. I mean, how important they were probably the socialists were more important, not the communists, the socialists. But they were there. They were certainly part of that, yeah.
And of course, the emergency is frequently invoked today by critics of the Modi government when they point to suppression of dissent and free expression. How appropriate is that comparison?
So there's some very interesting parallels and similarities, because I was a college student in the emergency in Delhi, so I remember it quite vividly, apart from having studied the records and written about it, and of course we are living through this time. Now the parallels are clearly the attack on institutions by the union government, the creation of a personality cult around the Prime Minister. I mean, I quote in the new chapter of the book, I quote some remarks by J.P. Nadda, President of the BJP, on Narendra Modi's 71st birthday, which were very similar to the kind of stuff that Devakanta Barua, as President of the Congress, used to say about Indira Gandhi. So that personality cult, those are the similarities. There are differences. Some of the differences are cheering. For example, the fact that during the emergency, the Congress was in control of every major state except Tamil Nadu, whereas today the BJP does not rule over large parts of southern and northern India and eastern India, I beg your pardon, and of course, nor does it rule over the important state of Punjab. That should be cheering. On the other hand, there are differences that are depressing, particularly the majoritarian caste of the ruling party and the Prime Minister, which was absent in the Congress of the 1970s. But the parallels are there, without question, yeah.
So towards the end of the book, you reference a work written by Rajni Kothari in 1970, in which he's spoken of the Congress system of Indian politics. And for many years after independence, Kothari noted, the Congress had presented itself as the authoritative spokesman of the nation, as well as its affirmed agent of criticism and change. That system, you note, has since been replaced by the BJP system. What characterizes this BJP system?
So, obviously, again, it's a pan-Indian party. It has national ambitions. It wants to be here forever. It has a charismatic Prime Minister. The Congress had two, Nehru first and then Indira. It wants to impose its ideology on not just political and public life, but on the legislative system as well. It's a different ideology from that of the Congress of the Freedom Struggle, for sure. But it is again a one-party dominant system. And in the new edition, I quote, should I just read out one part?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So in the new edition, I quote C. Rajagopalachari, who had left the Congress in the late 50s to start the Swatantara Party, the great freedom fighters was C. Rajagopalachari. And this is what he wrote in 1958 about the Congress that was then hegemonic. If subservience and slavish adulation take the place of independent thinking, and criticism is never resorted to, but with fear and trepidation, the atmosphere quickly breeds the political diseases peculiar to democracy. Without the free and critical atmosphere of a well-balanced democracy, wrote Rajaji, in 1958, India is witnessing the growth of the weeds of careerism, intrigue, and various types of degrees of dishonesty. And opposition is the natural preventative for such poisonous weeds. And opposition is therefore the urgent remedy indicated by the symptoms. Now, this chapter also has an epigraph from Rajaji, which he says, one second, he says, when one party always remains in power and dissent is dissipated among unorganized individuals and groups and relatively insignificant groups, unorganized individuals, and when dissent is dissipated among unorganized individuals and relatively insignificant groups, and one party remains in power, when these groups do not and cannot coalesce, government will inevitably become totalitarian. So this is him writing about 1958 about Nehru's Congress, and it's so strikingly resonant when you think of Modi's BJP today. So, the parallels are quite chilling.
In a volume she edited 3 years ago, Nirja Jayal noted that the BJP doesn't just want to reform India, it wants to reform India. What are the disjuncts you see with the past that the BJP has effected so far?
Well, obviously it wants to, we've talked about religion, to remake this as a Hindu majoritarian state, in theory and in practice. Some elements in the BJP would, not the Prime Minister, but the Home Minister would want to impose Hindi on the South and the East, for sure, undermining our institutions and their autonomy. So it is, in that sense, a reforming, a reshaping of the Indian Republic. Some people have talked about the making of a second republic. I think that's premature, but the intentions are clear.
Going back to the emergency, in the post-emergency period, what were the forces that allowed us to reinvigorate our institutions, and what can we learn from that, from perhaps for the period when perhaps the BJP system passes?
Well, I think undoing the amendments to the Constitution. Let me tell one story about the original edition of the book. Every assertion in this book is documented by some primary source, a letter, a document, a parliamentary speech, a book, a scholarly article, except one. And this is a remark made by J.B. Kripalani during the emergency. Kripalani was already in his 90s, great freedom fighter, socialist leader who left the Congress, and presently warned about the border conflict and asked Nehru to sack Krishna Menon in 1959, and so on. He was in hospital, very sick, with all kinds of tubes passing through him, and a young follower of Kripalani went to see him in jail, and as you would do when an elderly relative is ill and is dozing, you would put your hand on their forehead. And Kripalani got up, saw his young friend and said, I have no constitutional left, all that remains are amendments. And I say, this is the only assertion in this book for which I have no document. It was told to me by some chela of Kripalani in 78 or 79, after the emergency went. So I think, if you look at the redoing of the Constitution, by the way, I am told that a great servant of Indian democracy is critically ill. This is the lawyer Shanti Bhushan. And we don't know how much longer he has with us. And he is an architect of the restoration of the Constitution. He was law minister under Morarji Desai. So, what Morarji Desai and Shanti Bhushan did to restore trust in the Constitution. Now, when this kind of thing will happen, some people argue, there's some economists in the audience, it would be nice to have their views on this. Some people argue that the revival of the Supreme Court really took place in the 80s and the 90s, when we did not have majority governments in the center, 90s onwards. Some economists believe that coalition governments have been much better for economic growth as well. Certainly they're better for federalism. So I think the thing to hope for, if you're an Indian Democrat who wants a reinvigorated Supreme Court, a freer press, more robust federalism, better and more balanced economic growth, is do not give a party a majority in 2024, right? So maybe that would be the first step, because I think that may be a way of reviving these institutions.
Long before the BBC aired the Modi question, you wrote a column saying that Modi should apologize for the Gujarat riots. Yeah. His followers, of course, say that the Supreme Court has given him a clean chit. Why do you think he should apologize?
Well, you see, it's not a question of the Supreme Court. There was a clear dereliction of duty. If you look at, there are people here who have written about the Gujarat riots, and I would urge, I think I mentioned 4 books in that article, I'm trying to recollect all of them. One is Gujarat Making of a Tragedy, edited by Siddharth Vajarajan. The other is Revati Lord's book on Gujarat. The third is the police officer R.B.C. Kumar's book, who's been unfairly victimized by this government. I forget the fourth. But if you look at all the, and you look at the Editors Guild report of that time and all the journalism, the administration should have done much more and let the riots happen. Now, whether the chief minister was guilty personally, he was chief minister. And if you look at, in 84, exactly that happened. In 84, in this city, the anti-Sikh pogrom could have been stopped by the prime minister and the home minister if they wanted. And I was then, in 84, I was a student in Calcutta. And in Calcutta, by the way, there were probably 50,000 Sikhs, many of whom were taxi drivers, marked out by their turban. And Jyoti Basu told the police not one of them will be harmed. And Jyoti Basu was not a great chief minister in other respects. But he had been a young man when Mahatma Gandhi went on fast in 1947 in Bilagata. And he'd been there at that fast. So he knew how dangerous and poisonous communal conflict was. So 84 and 2002, there were many parallels. And Manmohan Singh, to his credit, and Sonia Gandhi, to her credit, went to the Golden Temple and kind of apologized. And Manmohan Singh made a speech in Parliament, acknowledging. So I think that is something that will always hang over him. And let me say this. I have not seen the film. But I'm told my college contemporary Chopin Dasgupta is quoted in that film. I've not seen what he has said. But I have been with Chopin Dasgupta in a TV studio before Narendra Modi became Prime Minister. And when he admitted, he said, Narendra Modi will always we still bears the cross of 2002. He said this in 2013. He may have changed his mind for whatever reason. But Modi still bears that cross. He was Chief Minister then, and he should have, even now, I mean, it's like, you can say that it should not have happened. You could say I was young, I was inexperienced. Likewise with Rajiv Gandhi in 84, he'd just been sworn in. You can make the similar arguments. But everyone who's been there, I mean, I remember, and I think I may have mentioned that in an article, I have a very long connection with Ahmedabad, which is a personal connection that well predates my writing about Gandhi. And I remember going there after the riots. And I remember the fear and the terror that was there. And the caretaker of the Sabarmati Ashram told me, he said, this is a second assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. Because it happened in Ahmedabad. So in that sense, yes, I mean, obviously he's not going to do it because he's an incredibly proud man. He's never made a mistake in his life. I mean, if you look at his whole, he takes credit for everything. But look at what happened in Joshimath. Okay, no word. I mean, if there was a bridge to be inaugurated in Joshimath, he'd be there cutting the ribbon. Right. That's his personality. That's okay. But it's a horrific event, And I think Vajpayee recognized it because he said that. So that says this, whatever, regardless of the BBC documentary, the documentation by Indian writers, Indian scholars, is all there about 2002, and it's irrefutable. Modi should have done much more to stop it, and he did not.
You've written frequently, all too frequently, some people would say, about how the Gandhi family is facilitating Hindutva by staying in power. After those heroic images yesterday of Rahul Gandhi, Ferran braving a snowstorm, having walked thousands of kilometers, has your opinion changed about him just a wee bit?
You see, I've always said he's a decent man, and that he remains. But it's an open question as to, I mean, firstly, morally, I mean, as someone who is a historian of Indian democracy, grown up in the 1960s, I mean, I cannot abide a fifth generation dynast leading the party of the freedom struggle. I think it's morally wrong, Even what happened in Srinagar, right? Now I was saying this, look, why should Priyanka be there next to him? Why can't they be Baghel and Gehlot or somebody else? Or Siddharamaiah or Shiv Kumar, What kind of message is that sending? Kiska theka hai, I think, and, I'll tell you something, what we don't recognize, the damage that the family control of the Congress party has done to Indian democracy. Well, Indira Gandhi started it by bringing Sanjay Gandhi in 1975. Last month, in Tamil Nadu, Stalin made his son a minister. The DMK was a great party of regional pride. It stood for caste and gender equality, for good administration. Now it's a family party. Look at the Akalis. The Akalis is the second oldest political party in India. It has a noble and admirable lineage. And the Badals made it a family party because they saw what Indira Gandhi was doing and what Sonia Gandhi was doing. So the Thackeray's do the same thing, the Yadavs do the same thing, the Raos do the same thing, and so on. It is absolute disfiguring for Indian democracy to have family control over parties. Family control over one set of parties, personality cults with the other set, which is Kejriwal, Modi, Mamta, etc. Now, this is, as an Indian Democrat, I find both repugnant. Whatever the decency of Mr. Rahul Gandhi, that the fact remains. No, you can't allow great political parties to become family firms. That's just wrong.
I think we're going to be running out of time soon, and we'll throw it open to the audience for questions. But one last question. What are you working on now?
So I'm doing something very different. This book is in the new edition, 940 pages long. I've been set a challenge by a young writer I admire, whom I shall not name. And the challenge is, write a book under 200 pages. And I think I may have met that challenge. This is a book about my relationship with my first editor, Rukun Advani, who actually made me a published writer, who taught me how to write social history, then helped me when I wrote biography, who encouraged me to write on cricket, and who still is a kind of a sounding board. Though he did not edit this book, he is still a sounding board. So it's a writer's tribute to a self-effacing and faceless editor. Based on our correspondence over 40 years, and he's a wonderful correspondent. He doesn't like speaking, but he likes writing, and he's got a acerbic and wit and marvelous sense of style. So it's a book about the making of books based on a literary friendship and personal friendship of 45 years and counting.
And one more question before we throw it open to the audience. The subtitle of the book is different. The first edition was India's largest the history of the world's largest democracy. And now we're just a history. How did it get edited?
So it may change again. Now I'll have to ask the publishers and whether it's permitted to change it for the paperback, for the next reprint, which may come out in 6 months. There'll be a new maybe if Amazon and the indexing, the ISBN system allows, there may be a new subtitle. And it'll be called India After Gandhi, a history of the world's most populous nation. Which will be factual rather than celebratory.